people will take notice if you're invested in this and you're building in circles into your day-to-day lessons and into the life of your classroom. Things will start to change and people will take note.
This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Daniel Malec to the podcast. Daniel is a Restorative Practices Director at Georgia Conflict Center in Athens, Georgia. He has worked for over 20 years in the areas of youth development, youth violence prevention and intervention, conflict transformation, restorative justice, and school administration. He addresses all of those things and more in this podcast. But before we get into it, I'm so excited to announce that we are almost at our anniversary episode, which will occur on September 30th. In order to say thank you to our listeners like you, we would like to involve you in our anniversary episode. We want you to be our special guest on September 30th, so you can send us either a voice memo or a written email of any questions, comments, or topics that you want David and I to cover. You can send your ideas to amplifyrj@gmail.com. We look forward to hearing from you, and without further ado, let's get into this episode.
Daniel, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life.
Thank you.
Who are you?
I am a white cisgendered male from this place. I'm from Georgia.
Who are you?
I am life partner to my wife, Alice.
Who are you?
I am a father to 2 young men, a 16-year-old Nico and a 10-year-old named Oscar.
Who are you?
I am a brother. We've got 3 brothers, one of 4 boys and son, brother and a son.
Who are you?
I am I am somebody who has committed my life to nonviolence for about 20 plus years now, and so I've been learning that path for myself.
Who are you?
I'm a practitioner, a learner, a seeker of restorative justice.
And finally, for this who are you portion, who are you?
I'm a practitioner in Athens. I'm currently the executive director at the Georgia Conflict Center in Athens, Georgia.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for being here. We're going to get to all of those intersections in a moment, but it's always good to start with a check-in. So to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
Yeah, well, I got to exhale, I think. When you mentioned that earlier, that's a loaded question these days. I mean, it is August 2021, and it's a complicated world we're living in. And I work in schools, big part of my work, and I work in schools that are working really hard on protecting each other amidst this pandemic. Folks are, I don't see kids struggling much with wearing masks or taking care of each other. it's mostly the adults in the community. So I feel conflicted, but feel well, thankfully healthy. My family is healthy. We have our health, and grateful to be able to work among people day in and day out that are working to build restorative culture and community. So all that to say, I guess, grateful.
Yeah. Well, grateful for your family's health, your health as well. This is a time unlike anything that we've experienced in our lifetimes. Although, I was just listening to something earlier talking about how, history repeats itself. Of course, like the very specifics are different, but we as humans have experienced very similar things. I'm curious, in the last 17, 18 months, how you've managed, and I know at different times, different things have been things to lean on, but how have you managed to maintain balance or find balance to the extent that you've been able to?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I mean, balance for me often comes with working with my hands as well, and being we grow shiitake mushrooms on our small piece of land here in Athens, and we raise bees. We have a couple of beehives and grow food, and mostly greens, because we that's something that we can grow and realize that it is kind of the most nutritious thing that we can grow. So having over the last 17 years, 17 months, when the pandemic started, our work in schools pretty much drew to a halt immediately, right? And we have a team of folks that work in schools in Athens, and all that stopped for almost 2 months. And so a lot of my time shifted to being with my family and my kids, and then being outside and working on the land. And that was very nourishing and healing for me. And so I've tried to maintain that as we transitioned, like a lot of people, after about 2 months of realizing, those trainings that we had scheduled for April, we kept pushing them back, and we're like, I don't think that's ever going to be able to. So we began to think about how to do our work, particularly our training work, online. And I think my first virtual training began in July or June last year, and then kind of just picking up. So a balance of learning new ways of doing work, like in a way that I never imagined. I never imagined I would do restorative justice virtually, but also balancing that with the connection to the earth, and really recognizing, and I want to be clear in the skin that I'm in, because I think that's an important component. Also thinking about how we can be part of the solution in our community. My partner and I, how can we help folks that aren't able to get food and stuff? So we plugged into mutual aid networks and other networks in our community to make sure those most kind of marginalized and those that weren't going to benefit from government checks and whatnot, undocumented folks, that we could work together in community to first make sure folks' basic needs were met. So all those were things that kind of kept me going as we had this space of social distance and disconnection around us.
Yeah, there's so much to that, right? Both your work as somebody who is doing your work as like your job title is like executive director of an organization that is trying to bring justice, safety, equity to your communities, and like as a person who is actively participating in that, in the skin that you're in the communities that you're in, at the intersections of your identity. Like those all mean different things, and there's still the need to make sure that you can do this quote unquote sustainably for yourself, right? And so the ways that you plug in to being in relationship with the earth, being in good relationship with people are all so important, and a tricky balance for everyone.
Yeah.
In our unique circumstances. Definitely something that I am still struggling with. You've been doing this work of restorative justice, youth development, service for a long time, but that's not where you initially started your career. I'm curious, what were the roots of doing this work for you? How did you get started, even if it was before you knew the word restorative justice, specifically from a background in industrial engineering?
Yeah, thank you. So I went to Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I started out after that as working in a management consulting firm, and was doing that work for a few years, and started to pay attention to this. The insides of myself felt like they were shriveling up in some ways, and was having a real kind of, at 23, maybe 22, 23, having kind of a crisis of conscience, and really began a spiritual transformation at that point. And started, as I was traveling to different cities, I was traveling a lot. What stuck out to me was the folks living on the streets, the folks on the margins, and started paying attention to that more, and my own spiritual transformation took more and more root. And I ended up joining an organization called Jesuit Volunteers International, and moved to Managua, Nicaragua, after being a consultant for about 3 years. Moved down there and began to work with drug-addicted youth and youth in gangs in a particular neighborhood in Managua called Barrio El Recreo. And Barrio El Recreo was like many communities, or is like many communities in Managua, that it was started in around the 40s and 50s as kind of a squatter community of folks coming in from the countryside, putting up tin houses, very, not much bigger than the room that I'm in here, and then struggling to survive in Managua. And around that was established, some people's way of surviving was to sell drugs. Others did all kinds of different things. And so a lot of kids living on the streets would come to this neighborhood and buy glue. The shoe glue that's produced, now I forget the company here in the U.S. that produces it and sells it, knowing that kids throughout Latin America are addicted to this stuff. But they would buy that, and then crack cocaine started to be more of a reality while I was living there. And most of that, as I understood it, most of the crack was from cocaine that drug running boats would just throw overboard before they would be, encountered by police. And it would come to the shores, make its way to Managua, and then, become crack, and so I was working with youth as young as 10 up to maybe in their early 20s. So that was part of this spiritual transformation. And at that point, being a young white man, I thought I was going to help somebody. And I realized very quickly that it was about, these folks really saving my life and changing my perspective on the world, the hospitality that they offered to me, not just the youth, but everybody in Managua. I mean, as you know, our country has a very conflicted history with a lot of Latin America, but certainly Nicaragua. But I could go anywhere in that country and be welcomed into people's homes. They knew the history. They knew the reality. Many of them lived through war and violence that was perpetrated by either the U.S. or folks backed by the U.S. But they could not be more generous and welcoming, and many people would give their bed to me to sleep, and I didn't realize that. But then I realized, well, where else are they sleeping? So, I left this consulting world and went down to Nicaragua, to learn a different way. And it was in this work with youth that were in and out of the criminal legal system. They were the expendable youth. I was trying to, while I was there, it was like, how do we help these young people exit this cycle of violence and their families? I was visiting lots of families domestic violence, and it was like a constant cycle of violence for them. And so I was trying to explore, like, what could be a different way? How do we exit this cycle of violence? And it was in that pursuit that I was introduced to the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding in Virginia, Harrisonburg, at Eastern Mennonite University, through some folks that were working down there in Nicaragua. So I had to go all the way to Nicaragua to learn about restorative justice, and I still didn't know a lot about it. But then by going to apply to go to grad school to study more about conflict transformation, as soon as I started plugging into the restorative justice work, this was around 2003, I've never looked back. It's been the sweet spot for me in so many different avenues and ways.
Yeah. Do you remember the moment where you learned the words, or the context in which you learned the words?
I don't know. What comes to mind all the time for me, I don't know the moment I learned the words, but what the images that come to mind were me going to pick up youth that I worked with at the jail. They'd get picked up off the street, they'd be brought to jail, and then a few days later released. And it was this we talk about the revolving door. And it was literally a revolving door. And especially a white man comes to talk to somebody in jail, it was almost like an open door policy. They almost released them immediately. And so it was in that context that it was like, this is absurd. This is asinine that we are doing this. We're investing in these structures and systems. And at not long after that, somebody that was a Mennonite Central Committee volunteer introduced me to restorative justice. But I don't remember exactly how she phrased it. I just remember a light bulb going off for me of like, oh, that it makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. What was it? So sometimes people talk about an experience in Circle or an experience with some other felt experience. I'm curious, what was the thing that clicked for you?
Yeah, just the idea that these kids lived a life of harm, right? They were harmed themselves from a very young age. That was their day-to-day experience. In order to survive, they would ride the buses and rob folks. And so sometimes I saw them sometimes get shot at by people. So it was a life of harm, either perpetrating or being the victim of. And so just this idea of a different kind of way of dealing with harm, a way that brings people together and works together collaboratively to try to make it better. We actually, I don't think just learning about that kind of shifted how we did our work in the neighborhoods, because there were gangs throughout the neighborhood. There's about probably 50,000 people lived in this community, Barrio El Recreo, and I think there were about 5 different gangs. And our kind of team that worked with youth, we were some of the only people that could kind of navigate all those different terrains and areas. And just learning about restorative justice was like, well, how do we help each of these groups start to see this cycle of violence and start to see how, they have agency. Like, we don't have to just do it this way. And we ended up, starting to mediate between some of those gangs. And it was mixed results while I was there, and that work continued after I was there. But, it just brought us into a more active kind of role of attempting to intervene, to work with the youth to try to seek a different way of living. Because that was one thing I did learn from I've worked with gangs quite a bit since then. I've never met any youth in a gang that wants to be in the gang. We know that there are lots of needs that they're meeting by that, but every single one I met was looking for a way out. And so, restorative justice in the practices, even though I wasn't like trained or anything at that point, but the exploration of them with youth was I feel like a really helpful frame.
Yeah, I love the work that CJP does, and know a lot of folks who are there and who have gone through those programs. Definitely want to highlight for folks, and folks listening to this probably already know this, like the learning about restorative justice does not necessarily or does not necessitate a graduate degree. Right.
That's right.
It's community, it's people, it's those relationships in the communities that you're in. It's doing things with people, not a white savior paternalistically coming in and saying, this is what you need, here are these resources, right? But how do we share power, or how do we give you power, agency in this situation so you can meet the needs of yourself, right? The people who are in your community, the people who have been impacted by the harm that you've been a part of. And all that to say, like, graduate education can help. I'm curious, as you transitioned from Nicaragua back to the States and grad school, what was that experience like for you?
It was so I came back. I lived in Nicaragua for 3 years. I was contemplating never coming back just because it was such an amazing place. But I also recognized that I might need to learn how to impact things in the United States, given that that's where a lot of conflict is generated. And so I came back in 2002. So here we are, as the U.S. just has left Afghanistan, quote unquote, after almost 20 years. Back, I, was protesting the initial intervention at the embassy in Managua with all kinds of other people on a weekly basis way back in 2001 and whatnot. So I came back to the U.S. in 2002, and it was quite an environment to come back to. It was, just the culture shock that, folks coming to the U.S. either for the first time or not having been here in a while experience, and just really surprised about the dialogue and debate that was happening at that time. So seeking out the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding, CJP, it was called the Conflict Transformation Program at that time, what was very much kind of a balm for me, like a way to take care of myself coming back to the U.S. And I am so grateful for them as well. And also agree with you that a graduate degree, like I had the opportunity to learn from elders, Chief Lawrence Hart comes to mind, who's a Cheyenne chief and elder who, lives restorative justice and has long before these words were invented. And I just remember him feeling affirmed. I had the opportunity to present at a Indigenous Sovereignty Symposium, and I presented on the Cheyenne way as a restorative way of solving problems and doing, and kind of their law system was rooted in, it was an example of this, what we now call restorative justice. And I just remember him coming and asking me, so do you think we do restorative justice? It was a hard question, because here I am, a white man with this frame that's come out of the U.S., and he's lived this way for so long, but he's coming to me to ask this. It was a little overwhelming, and humbling. And Harley Eagle Lakota, who also has done so much work with this, I've had the opportunity to learn from him, and then of course Kay Pranis and so many others. So I guess your question about what was that like? It was incredibly refreshing and nourishing and just a gift. It was really a gift and an opportunity that I am so glad I did not pass up, because it was another thing that kind of changed my life and trajectory to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so from there, right, we just had someone, Darshil Kaur, come through, and she graduated from, quote unquote, graduated from the program, within the last couple years, and talked about how, the program as it exists now is experience driven. What did you focus on while you were in the program?
Yes, my focus was restorative. Back then you could have a concentration, I think they called it, and mine was restorative justice. So, being with Howard Zare on a regular basis was a great gift. He was a regular professor back then. Another amazing gift back in those days was that Fulbright, anybody that wanted to come to the U.S. to study conflict or conflict transformation or peace building were all sent to Eastern Mennonite University, to the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding. And so who I studied with was a cohort of a group of folks from Africa, from all over, from Nigeria, from Kenya, from the Congo, and then at the same time, folks from the Middle East. At the same time, people from Southeast Asia. At the same time as folks from the Far East. And so it was like just the most incredible experience to learn, because a lot of the learning, of course, happened outside of the classroom, and just gathering with folks. And so my focus was restorative justice, but my learning was a lot about culture, a lot about how conflict is perceived and engaged in different cultures, and just learning from people who come from pretty extreme situations, who then were going back to their country and just doing amazing work, sometimes with their lives threatened and whatnot, but going back kind of empowered. And so that was also a big part of my learning.
Right. So the framing of the question might be different from what you have experienced, but Darshil did like a practicum in Chicago. Was that still a part of your learning in doing this work, not just in the classroom, but like on the ground? Not to make this all about CJP, like a commercial for CJP, but yeah.
Yes, Howard Zare connected me to one of my superheroes, Barb Taves, and she would definitely be. She's amazing, but mostly I just get good feelings because she's so fun to be around. But I had the opportunity to go and work in Philadelphia at the Pennsylvania Prison Society with Barb. That's where she was working at the time. And she happened to be in the midst of writing the Little Book of Restorative Justice for People in Prison. And also she happened to be basically scrapping what she had been writing and reproduce this, what exists now, while I was working with her. And so she ended up and me exploring with her, really shifting the focus of that work to looking at experience of trauma and restorative justice as healing. And you see in that book that it's really about a journey of healing and a journey of healing in community. So for my practicum, I worked with Barb, and I worked in prisons. I worked most extensively at the Muncie Women's Prison in central Pennsylvania, and Muncie, like many prisons, was built, beautiful facility, built in the, I think, right around the turn of the 20th century, in the early 1900s, as a reform school for girls. It was built as a reform school for girls, and then so girls that misbehaved or did not fit in their environments. And over time, it transformed then to a minimum security prison, then to a medium security prison, and now today it's a maximum security prison for women. And so I was working with lifers there, who invited Barb and invited me in because this idea of restorative justice was a lifesaver for them, right? If they're going to have to spend their life in this prison, how do we make this a space of healing, a space of compassion, of making right when wrong is done? So that's what I had the opportunity to work with women there. Still, I'm in touch with one of them who, it's been almost 20 years now, and we're still writing. And she was incarcerated at the age of 17, and she was accompanying somebody who I think committed murder. She had no part in it, but she's spending her whole life, and that person has gotten out through some, but she's still there, and so that's what my work was to explore restorative justice with women incarcerated. And then also at that time there was a play called Bodies in Motion, and that play was an experience of trauma and the impact of kind of violent crime on people. And that play had toured about 8 different prisons in Pennsylvania before I was working with Barb. And then so when I went and I conducted focus groups with prisoners about their experience viewing that play, and so just got to do a number of things in Pennsylvania and in the prisons there, learning from absolute masters of this work, and that's no joke. I mean, these people are incredible.
I didn't know this about you before, but from what I've gleaned from what's available from you on the internet is like this wide experience of doing restorative justice, both within the construct of the criminal legal system, as you just shared, but you've taken that to so many different places. I'm curious, we can go chronologically if that's easier, but what you've done this work in schools, you've done this work in community settings, you've done this work with organizations. What came next from CJP?
Oh my goodness, yeah. So I very much a revolutionary. I still believe I am. I'm just a little more. I don't know how, but at that time I was connected with some lovely, amazing people, and we had a dream of building something like Highlander Folk School, but up in New England. And we got invited to explore this vision on 57 acres of land in Connecticut. And we were the 3 of us. I guess I could, Mary Novak and Harold Burns and I were the kind of the founding partners of Voluntown Peace Trust. And it was intended to create a space for folks on the margins doing peace and justice work to be able to come. We had a little conference center. We called the A.J. Musty Conference Center. We had a number of kind of houses where people could stay. One was the Rachel Corrie House, named in honor of Rachel Corrie, who was run over by a Caterpillar tractor as she was defending a Palestinian home in 2003. So the Rachel Corrie House, we had the Ahimsa House. And so we were inviting folks almost it was either free of charge or for very little money. And we offered facilitation of trainings and workshops, but also just space. So we were there, and then we also had like a community supported agriculture. So it was, again, this integration of sustainable action with, social change type stuff. And I was there for 3 years with them, and just, great opportunity there were so many doing that work there already, obviously, all around kind of New London and in southern Connecticut and Boston. We were connected with folks there. It was a beautiful time and place to be. And then from there, I joined my partner Alice in New York and worked as a director of restorative justice at a school that was entirely for young people transitioning out of the juvenile legal system, coming out from being locked up. It was not, I love the idea, the model. In New York, most of the teachers that worked there were teachers that were in the, quote, rubber room, meaning they didn't have a job at any other school. So they're hanging out in the rubber room, and they would employ them at this alternative school. And so it was chaotic. It was lots of opportunities for restorative justice. But really a lot of it should have been around adult harm towards young people, but we didn't get there as much. So I did that for a little bit, and then we moved to Washington, D.C., and I worked at the Latin American Youth Center for about 4 years. And so the next place I really, at LAYC, where I really was able to bring in restorative justice, was I worked in group homes for young people in the foster care system. And it was, with restorative justice, like as you do the work, it just, the thing that's powerful for me is how it becomes a way of life, right? And so I was just talking with one of the youth on Sunday that I'm still connected with, that I worked with back then. And he talked about how his experience in foster care was so different when we worked together, when he lived in the house, because it was all about building community. We used the circle to talk, all of our meetings were done in circle. And for me, that was just natural at that point. But for him, it was it was totally different than anything he had experienced. He was more used to people with the power over, consequences. You do this, you're in trouble. And we had a community, and the kids, nobody fought, we had our ways of solving problems. And so that was an amazing place to experiment with restorative justice. It was a community of 6 young people. We had 2 houses, 6 boys and 6 girls in the other house. And, what a better environment to try out building community through restorative practices. And then became the Community Peacebuilding Director at Latin American Youth Center, and we hired our first restorative justice facilitator. He should be coming on your show at some point. Tarek Masarani he got his start doing restorative justice work. That's how he says it anyways, working with us at the Latin American Youth Center. And then we started going into schools and offering restorative support. And that's what led me to be the restorative justice coordinator at E.L. Haynes High School. And then after that, the assistant principal of restorative practices at E.L. Haynes in D.C. This feels weird, but I guess you are interviewing me. But it's calling to mind again just what a beautiful opportunity, and for me it's opening myself up to the movement of the Spirit, as however you see that, and really allowing that to put these pieces together, and working at E.L. Haynes was an amazing place. It was a newer high school, and they were just trying to explore how to solve problems without suspending kids. And so they were looking at it from a very responsive kind of way. And I entered in there with that same kind of mindset of using restorative justice to respond to harm, to keep kids in the building, but solve problems. And the 4 years I was there, we did, build community building circles and whatnot, but very limited. And so I think our results were limited as well. Like we were not able to shift our frame to say, this is about culture and community and connection, and really proactively building that. And, I take responsibility for that because I think that was my role. But when we see restorative justice just as a way of responding to harm, we're missing the richness of the practice as I think it's been taught for generations and practiced for centuries, because it transforms culture when we use it as a tool for dialogue, a tool for, building community. And I did learn at E.L. Haynes that a school environment is an incredible space because you have kind of a contained community that has margins and periphery and families and a surrounding community and whatnot. But once you teach the tools and then you practice, you have something that's strong enough to deal with any challenge, right? And I started to taste that and experience that there at E.L. Haynes. I was at Latin American Youth Center for about 4 years. Then I was at E.L. Haynes for about 4 years building restorative culture and restorative practices. And then we went on a year journey. My family and I, we sold our house, we quit our jobs, we moved into a van, and we traveled around the country for a year. And we call our boys road scholars because they were road schooled for that year. And then we ended up in Athens. We didn't know where we were going to end up, but we ended up here for a number of reasons. One, my brother is here and his family. My parents aren't far. But also we felt a real kind of call to come down south, right, where the historical oppression is thick. You still feel it in towns like Athens, the segregation, the inequity, which exists in cities around the country, but it particularly felt palpable here in Athens. And so we wanted to be close to family, and we wanted to really dig in and contribute to community healing in a way that being closer to where I'm from felt like we could do. So this is where we've been, and when we got here, the school district here was beginning to explore and learn about restorative justice. So it kind of, again, was right place at the right time. And I started working. John Lash was the executive director at Georgia Conflict Center at the time. And he and I met doing restorative justice things years earlier. And he and I just started accompanying the school district on an exploration of what kind of restorative practices would look like. Whether, does it make sense to try to do this district-wide, or should we start with some schools? And the decision was made to kind of, and this was at Tarek Maserani's guidance, who had been doing a lot of work in D.C. for a good long time. He said, why don't you take an approach where you offer it out and see who is interested in exploring kind of whole school restorative practices. And so we did that, and we've been working with 3 schools in particular, and plenty of others, but 3 schools have been diving deep, really wanting to address inequity in the schools and exploring kind of racial inequity, as well as how do we transform everything we do at our school to be restorative. And so it's been a real gift to be walking alongside an elementary school, a middle school, and a high school in Athens in Clark County for the past 3 years. And, of course, setbacks with the pandemic, and that really this last year would have been the third year so the kids that started in sixth grade back when we started at Clark Middle, last year they were eighth graders. And the times we did have them in the building, we realized that restorative practices and circles are kind of like riding a bike. You don't lose it, because when they got back in the building, they just plugged right back in. When there was conflict, it's time to circle up. This is the students, not the adult. I mean, the adults too, but the students. Let's circle up. And they had a capacity to solve problems without adults that we hadn't seen with a student. So it was real unfortunate that we didn't get the whole year with that group. But at the same time, we realized that, this is part of a journey. And they're now at a high school that also is working on whole school restorative practices. So we have experts all among us in these spaces that our job is to figure out how to tap into their expertise and allow them to lead and guide this work. So that's kind of where we are now.
Yeah, I'm realizing a couple things as I continue to grow as the host of the space and as an interviewer. Sometimes I ask questions that are too expansive, right? And as a circle person, like, I don't want to interrupt you, right? Because you kind of just gave me like the last 20 years, which I think is beautiful. And like there were so many points in there that I wanted to be like, follow-up question, follow-up question, follow-up question. I'm going to circle back to some of those. But what stood out to me as you were sharing the experiences in many of those spaces, specifically in the foster care space and within schools, is two things. One, the idea of doing things with people and sharing power instead of mandating things, like you were highlighting when we were talking about your experiences in Nicaragua, making sure that the experiences that people are having and the ways that they're going about addressing their problems, they have influence in those things. And, of course, proactively having input in building those cultures, those communities as well. The other thing that stood out to me that I don't think that I've thought about as a particularly restorative way of being before, and maybe it's kind of just a way that people who are drawn to this work tend to be, but this idea of giving up control in your life, right? Of course, like when we're in a space, when we're facilitating a space, we are not there to dictate what happens. We're there to create the container and let the people in the space do what they do. We give up control in that sense. But what I heard from you, and as you traveled from place to place, is going where opportunities are. And I don't know how much you did that with intention or not. I've tried to, and I was reflecting on my journey through this work, some of it being pretty strategic and working out well for me, and then other times the opportunities or the doors were open and taking advantage of those. I'm curious if you've thought about that being a restorative practice, a restorative way of being, or just something that you've embraced as part of your life.
It's a good question. I've just learned over the years, like, a lot of the moves we've made or I've made have been ones where a lot of people around me are like, why would you do that? Like, leaving the consulting realm was the first one of like, you're good. You got what you need. You got a good job. Why would you do that? And I realized that when I felt the movement inside that was counter to that, it was like, I got to go with that, because especially each time I did that and found, like nourishment and kind of rightness, I guess, in terms of a restored, like I found that it was the right move in terms of my spirit, and so that became, haven't really necessarily considered that because that began before I was introduced to restorative practices, but it's definitely been, before I sit down to a circle, I'm definitely going to take a moment of meditation and prayer. I try to do it in the space that we're going to be in and have that moment to allow, because the energy that happens is so much, in those spaces is so much greater than me and beyond me. I want to tap into that, and so that very much is part of my restorative kind of framework and how I see the work. But it comes from, just a place of trying to be led by spirit and in my faith and things like that. I think that's where it originally emerged. And then, over time, you just start seeing how that will bring you to a better place than trying to do it yourself.
Right. And I was going to say, and it's not that those things are separate. Like, all of those things are interconnected. The way that you are in one space is the way that you are in, so many others. And so it was just a pattern that I was picking up on as you were telling the chronology of where you've been. And you kind of highlighted a lesson from each of those spaces that you took. We haven't had a lot of people here in this space talk about the foster care system, right? We've talked about criminal legal system, schools, and we're going to dig into schools a little bit more in a second. But when you think about foster care, it is a system of constant separation, right? And restorative justice being about connection, community, and then reconnection. Have you seen beyond your time there, like, models of this being like restorative justice being proliferated within foster care spaces?
Not enough. I mean, I when I was there, the place I was, the home was called the Independent Living Program, ILP. And I was just so surprised that so much of the foster care system actually creates dependence, right? It doesn't create independence. And so just shifting how we operated, how we made decisions in that space, turning it all upside down, because to me, restorative justice was so helpful in that. And because we don't, like, I was working with 16 to 18-year-old. We don't have time for this creating dependency. And so, but that's how a lot of what's done is structured. Of course, because it's about meeting needs and taking care of folks, but not creating dependence. So I have not encountered a lot of restorative spaces around foster care. It's deeply needed because I think there's a lot of opportunity there for transformation and changing how we relate to one another within that system.
Yeah, and of course, like, this work belongs everywhere, right? But your direct experience with, like, the impact of people feeling real senses of belonging, right? Even though, I don't know what the direct circumstances of that were, like, I don't imagine that they were there for, like, an incredibly long amount of time, right? Where folks were in and out.
Yeah, although they tended to like it there, and so they did have some say about, and so we had generally would have youth for, like, sometimes up to 3 years. And if they got the chance, they would stay there rather than go to some of the other options that were out there, because, these young people had been to lots of different spaces and many of them were destructive. And, so yeah, the youth I worked with was for years, because we would even stay in touch with them as they moved on to another space. They would come back and do workshops with us and things like that. So, yeah.
Yeah, and now that I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about a space that I know in Chicago, which I'm forgetting the name of, that does things similar, where, the youth are then employed as quote-unquote peace ambassadors to do some of this work in communities and schools as well. And so that can also be a model for that, but making sure that, like, how you're talking about in schools, like it's not just about that repair of harm, right? It's what are the things that we're doing proactively to make sure that we have something to restore to. We have a foundation of relationships to come back to, similar to what you were talking about in prisons. Sometimes, yeah, we are repairing that harm process, but we're stuck here with these people for a very long time. What is the community that we want to have here? What is, you talked about having a space of compassion, right? How do we make sure that, while we are confined in these spaces for very long periods of time, unjustly, and we can criticize prisons all we want, but there are people who exist in those spaces, right? And so what are the ways that we can meet the needs of the folks involved is so crucial. I'm curious, you talked about how when you moved into that role of restorative practices assistant principal, right, a lot of the emphasis was on that response to harm that was happening, right? And you had seen that in other school systems as well. I know you talked about doing things differently if you had the chance to, spending a lot more time proactively. What would those things have looked like? And I imagine those are some of the things that you're coaching your schools to do now, but what are those things?
Yeah. So starting very much with the adults and creating safe and brave spaces for adults to dialogue about, they're working day in and day out, working so hard to educate young people. Let's start together to reflect on how is this going for us? How do we feel like we're doing? What brings you joy? What brings you pain? So starting to introduce and teach the circle process with adults first, in doing it consistently with adults, so that they can both benefit from having a space of, a democratic space for dialogue, teaching the principles and values through circle, but then to reflect on their reality, because, when you're just doing responsive, it's not going to really transform an environment as much as when you really build it into the fabric of the way we operate. So let's start with the adults. Let's create a space for dialogue. Let's give adults agency in this process of education that we are doing. And so starting there, and then once the adults, and also having a leadership team within the school that goes deeper into training, into learning about restorative justice, and having really creating that team, because they become your champions as well. But also what I love about that model of training 8 to 12 folks within the school really deeply in restorative justice, then you have a ready group of circle keepers, right? They're your circle keepers. And if we're going to do circles regularly, we need 8 to 12 circle keepers that can just take a flow and they can go with it. They can make it their own. So that's the other beautiful thing of having this group of leadership, of champions. And that group should be as representative of your, it should look like your student population as much as possible. You should have special education representation, ESOL. And then little by little, let's invite students into that group. Let's prepare students to be leaders. So there's that. And then how do we, once we're doing it as adults, then we can start to do it regularly with students, both in an advisement type space to start with, but also in academic spaces. How do we see circles as a way of reclaiming academic time, of building democratic decision making in your classroom? All of those kind of, setting norms together, agreements. Let's start there before we even explore as a way of repairing harm. And that's, for people that are just learning about restorative practices, that's what I say is that's how the culture change happens, because then when there are problems, it could be an incident of racism inside or outside the community, or it could be we have the circle that we go back to. And then when there is a situation of harm, we have the circle to go back to. We have these, and it really demystifies, it destigmatizes, it takes the punitive nature out of hard conversations, because we know the principles. We know it's about a non-hierarchical space where it's a voluntary space, those kind of things. So that's what I would have done differently. Yeah. And also, like, making sure that we are really focused on a positive culture in our building, really, our language, our way of empowering students to take on leadership, because that's a foundation. Things like positive behavior interventions and supports, like how are we building positive environment and community, and, having the quadrant that we know that where power with is in the top right corner. Mm-hmm. This idea of the y-axis being about structure and having high expectations. Yeah, we've got to believe, first of all, that the students that we work with can achieve at really high levels. We have to believe that. We have to practice that. And then we have to put the structures in place to make sure people can achieve at that level. So there's periphery around restorative justice that I think needs to be part of it as well. Cause it can't do it all itself. It's part of this journey of building community and connection in schools.
Yeah. Not a panacea, not a cure-all, definitely not something overnight.
That's right.
For folks who listen to this podcast, right, what you talked about gets to this idea of the quote that I say the most often by James Baldwin, right? Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them, right?
Yes.
And so that piece about starting with adults is so crucial. When I think about that, I'm curious what your response to the pushback of like, but that's going to take so much time. We don't have time for that. What is this way that you navigate that resistance?
Yeah. Definitely we get that. I guess that's where we inviting folks in. One, like, how do we make sure that we're offering the technical assistance, because circle is hard. It's different than what we're used to, especially as teachers. This sharing power in my classroom is hard. I don't get it. Saying sorry as an adult to a youth is hard. All these things, like you said, like they're going to mimic. So how do we be accountable for ourselves and our own behavior? How do we be respectful? So making sure that we have good ways of supporting teachers, and that they have the technical assistance that they need. We're collecting data on, if we're saying we're doing circles in all of our spaces, let's make sure we are, and let's capture that data, and let's show folks how. So we just did a process evaluation in our schools in Athens. It's on our website. Folks are welcome to check that out at gaconflict.org. But one of the things that came out of that is we have to stop measuring our work in restorative justice based on the metrics of a punitive system, right? Like, we want to know, have referrals decreased, have ISS and OS decreased, and they damn well better if we're doing restorative justice, right? Of course they should. But is that really, how are we capturing how this culture is transforming? How are we measuring growth? Students that have grown up, they know their toolbox is full of ways of fighting, but now they've got a toolbox that has other tools of dialogue and problem solve. So how are we measuring that? Like, if we're just going to keep measuring things based on the thing that we know is dysfunctional and has caused harm for generations, then we're probably not going to see the results. So helping people imagine other ways of seeing change, and measuring impact on the culture and the climate of your classroom and your community. But really it's for me that question of it takes too long. Where I have gone more is to invest my time and energy in those that are wanting to try this out, because then those that aren't are going to see the transformation going on over here at that end of the hall. These 3 teachers are doing it. They've committed to it as a team. Things are transforming down there, so I might want to plug in.
Yeah.
And so I get tired of trying to convince people, and more it's teaching and going where the energy is and supporting that, because that's where the transformation happens.
I love that answer. There's something about, we're doing this because the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration as a whole has devastated communities. But as much as abolition, right? And I think this is Ruth Wilson Gilmore. I might be wrong. Ruth Wilson Gilmore talking about how abolition is as much about building life-giving institutions as much as it is about dismantling the ones that are causing harm. If that's Miriam Kaba, I'm sorry. But right, like, what are the things that we're doing, not just to dismantle, but to replace, create? I listen to a lot of podcasts. I was listening to something earlier about, diet and our eating habits. And it's so much easier to say, like, add healthy foods to your diet rather than like, you can't eat this, can't eat that, 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 right? Though, like you were talking about, like, the positive things, like, what are we adding to your toolbox, to your classroom practices, to all of these things, to set a vision for, healed community, like a vision around, like, no more suspension. Like, the easiest way to, like, decrease suspension rates is, okay, stop suspending kids. And then we're in that box of, like, permissive and neglect, but, like, if that was really the problem that we were trying to address, like, that's the solution. What we're trying to address is building communities, rooted in equity and trust, people feeling a sense of belonging, getting their needs met. And when there's conflict, we navigate that without being punitive.
Yes. Yeah. So we kind of frame that work as building the new in the shell of the old, right? Like, we can't just blow it up, even if we wanted to, or maybe you could, but we're working on building the new in the shell of the old. And that is, it has to be rooted in liberation. My good friend, Chuck Curtis, who, is at a school in DC. He does trainings with us and comes to Athens from time to time. I really appreciate, he's very clear that this is not just anti-racist. It's not just, it is about liberation, and it's about sovereignty, right? It's about empowering people to become who they are inside, underneath, and so I think that framework is important, because then you get into abolitionist teaching, you get into culturally all that stuff is part of it. But we have to, if we have that frame and we're going in there on a day-to-day basis, our relationship changes with the young people we're working with, I think.
Yeah. Is that something that you come into schools say? Like, do you come into school saying the words liberation?
Probably not at first.
Okay.
I also invite people, like, because I'm very, like, technical, and I want to teach these things well, and the practices, but the philosophy and the framework is important, and so that's why we do use that, like the schools that we're working with, we're in year 4, definitely. They're moving that work forward. They're having study groups around, I forget Bettina Love's book.
We want to do more than just survive.
Yes. Yeah. They're studying that together. They're doing this work themselves because they know now it's about liberation, and we've got to change dramatically. And that school, for instance, is everything they do now, they're passing through a restorative kind of filter. And they've thrown out demerits, for instance. We don't do demerits. We only do merits. They've thrown out detention. They've thrown a lot of their systems and structures are now entirely different. They don't have an ISS space. They have a peace room, and they have this other room called behavior and social emotional support, but neither of them are a punitive space that sometimes, so, you know, they're at the point now. And that's why when we started this journey, we said, if you're going to be committed to restorative practices and doing it whole school, think about a 5-year trajectory just to get started. Right. And they're at year 4, and they're like, they want everything to go through a restorative filter. Yeah. So it's exciting at this point.
Yeah. Both as someone who's been on the admin, like restorative assistant principal side, and as someone who has now been doing this work, bringing this into different school communities, along with, you know, the people who work with you in your organization, what would you encourage people who are thinking about, like, oh, my school needs this? Like, what are some steps to take, or like things that they need to be prepared for to really engage?
Yeah. I would suggest starting small. You know, like I promote and I teach whole school restorative practices implementation, because I think that really is what will transform culture. But we also teach, you start with where you are, right? We were working with 6 youth in the foster care system. And so can you start in your classroom? Can you start, and can you form a bit of a study circle with some others to explore what this could look like in your space? Start small and then build from there, I think. I don't want people to think that if your principal's not on board, then you can't do it. If your school district is going to, then you can't do it, because people will take notice. If you know, you're invested in this and you're building in circles into your day-to-day lessons, and into the life of your classroom, things will start to change and people will take notice. So, you know, start with what you have, start small, and then build community of others that want to explore and go from there. See what happens, because it could be exciting what happens.
Absolutely. I think that is a good place to transition into some of the questions that we ask everyone. I'm going to drop one more in. Like, there's questions that every white person who's been on this podcast has had to answer. As, you know, we are where we are in time, and you are a person who is white, who is doing this work. What do you see as your role in this work?
Thank you for asking that. I think part of my role is to never forget my whiteness. As I go into spaces to teach, to know that just my presence can be triggering for people. To recognize that a lot of people have experienced a lot of harm from people that look like me. And, you know, of course, recognizing that the privileges that have allowed me to explore restorative practices. And so to go into spaces, particularly with youth, you know, that idea, because I know my presence has regularly triggers young people, and they engage with me with caution. So how do I make sure that I am approaching this work with humility, with a beginner's mind, with a desire, a curiosity in the other, a curiosity of what guides them, and also not shying away from recognizing the impact of racism, the impact of inequitable schools, not mincing words around those things, not, so just, what I think restorative justice does not just exist to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. I think that's an important objective, of this work. And, so I just, being somebody who just recognizing where I'm located in this pyramid of oppression and being committed in every interaction to work to dismantle that and to own, because, I do have a colonized mind. And so to own when I make mistakes, and when people call me out, that's not just own it, but to welcome it, invite it. Please give me that feedback, and help me to be part of the struggle, is what I think is important in the skin that I'm in.
Yeah, I think like the layer, I'm asking that question out of curiosity and no judgment, because I don't have a response for like what exactly like Daniel should be doing in your space. Thank you for that answer. I'm curious, like when you're thinking about Georgia specifically, like this state where there are demographic, just like everywhere else in the country, demographics are changing, both like with racial demographics. With that comes political power shifts. You're sitting in this also in the state where the most infamous anti-Asian hate crime happened earlier this year, and so like you're in this space as not just a white person, as a white man who is the leader of a quote unquote leader of an organization. How have you thought about your role in your larger community of Georgia?
Yeah, thank you. I got to be of service, and our folks of color that are leading the movements here, making sure that they know anything they need. We're here for them. My partner and I were marshals at most actions and events, and we want to make sure that so when we had the opportunity to go to Standing Rock during the protests and the actions there, and we made sure that we were in the back peeling potatoes, and we kind of see that as our role, not being up front, but we're back. We see our work as peeling the potatoes and really actively seeking the leadership of people of color in this work. And so for me, I've only actually been executive director since the beginning of this month. I was Restorative Practices Director for 3 years, and I'm a reluctant executive director, particularly because I'm a white man doing this work. And so my number one intention is to build skills of people of color so that I'm not in this role for very long. And so that's in Georgia. It's taking leadership and direction very intentionally from people of color, and also making sure that we're building skills of people of color so that, pretty soon I'm sharing this role, and then I'm out of this role, is my objective, in who I am and where I am in this role in Georgia Conflict Center.
Yeah. Thank you. I think, there's not just for those of us who similar to you and I, right? There's some academic, financial, and male privilege that we're navigating. And then, you've got whiteness, and I still have internalized whiteness that I'm still wrestling with, but it doesn't show on the outside, right? How are we continuing to share power, give up power, right? Not make this work about us, and the way that we see things is so crucial. So thank you for those shares.
Yeah, thank you.
Now to the questions that everybody answers. Everybody answers. We've talked around it a lot, but for you, define restorative justice.
Restorative justice, I would define as first and foremost a way of being, a movement. It's restorative justice is a movement around a way of being that's rooted in principles of inclusion, radical inclusion, I think. Even when it's like, there's no way we can do this. Radical inclusion, democratic process, non-hierarchical process, and ways of being that build community and build up people, that promote healing and promote making right, I think is what the way I see restorative justice.
Yeah, for sure. As you've navigated this world, and you've shared like a handful of like broad things, but has there been like an oh shit moment? And what have you learned from it? Like something like specific, because we talked about like, responsive approaches rather than proactive, or we talked about like, saviorism, but like, is there a specific incident that comes to mind?
Well, I think the thing that's come to mind is a real practical, just not moving too quickly through the process. Like preparation, as we learn when we're training, is so important. And sometimes, as I've, been doing this work for the time I have, sometimes I'm like, oh, I got this. I don't necessarily need to check in with everybody before I bring them together. And the times that I have those oh shit moments is when I didn't do the work to really sit with people, hear from them what's going on, explain the process to them, and I'm too caught up in my own ego in the work and so that's when things have gone awry. And it's been, just a few times, because the process generally is strong enough even in those moments, but there's been some times where it's really gone south, and that's because I didn't do the work that you need to do in preparation to bring folks together.
Yeah, and I don't know if I've shared, that's resonating so hard. I don't know if I've shared this story on the podcast. If I did, it was a very long time ago. But the first school that I was doing this work in, on the first day, the principal was like, okay, there are these students who are having conflict, and like, we got to get them into the circle, this friend group, blah, 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 all these things, right? It was a he said, she said type of thing, right? And in this friend group, one of the people weren't there. But they really wanted to make sure that this conversation happened today. And because that one person wasn't there that had key information, going through that process in the moment, like, led to more harm. And this work, I think I'm going to attribute this to Ana Mercado, someone who used to be a supervisor of mine, shared with me, this work is so urgent, we need to slow down, right?
Yeah. Love it. Too urgent to rush. And, David, that comes from you wanting to move this work forward. You want to show people how this can work. And so they want to get them in the room right now. Okay, let's do it. And it's like, no, we need to slow it down. We got to slow this down. And I do want to potentially get them in the room, but we got to follow the process. Yeah. And in that way, you're teaching others too, about that level of intentionality of the work. But yeah, you and I've been there as well.
For sure. This one, you've listened to the podcast, so you might be prepared for. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they, and what's the question you ask the circle?
Wow. Gosh, I have heard you ask this. I'm not prepared for it. But what comes to mind for me is a conversation I had with La Hermana Ana Maria Murcia back in probably the 2000 about, we were actually talking about studying scripture, and she was talking about the analogy of mining for gold, really being patient and persistent and kind of seeking out those veins of gold and following them. And I think similarly, the roots of justice run deep. They run deep in our various traditions,
And I'm curious, I guess the question that comes to me first is, what from your roots of justice, from your life, your tradition, from your way of being, your mindset, do you think will help us in this day heal and build a better, more just and sustainable world? I mean, I think that for me is really the question. And so I would want to invite Ana Maria to join that. She is, I think somebody that's influenced my life just about more than almost anybody in her strength and courage. She was a woman of less than 5 feet, or is, yet with great courage, great strength, and great humility and tenderness of heart. So I'd like to invite Ana Maria. I'd like to invite Chief Lawrence Hart, who I've mentioned earlier. Just somebody that had really changed my life in very short time, and has deep roots in restorative justice. He was raised by his grandparents very much in the Cheyenne traditional way, and has done so much study of traditional Cheyenne justice. And so I'd love to invite Chief Lawrence Hart to the circle. Somebody else that comes to mind in terms of, I guess I'm going down this road of who has influenced my life. Also, somebody that I'd like to invite is Jerry Marie Leesgang. Jerry Marie is a incredible person, friend, trans activist, and somebody whose life really and way of being taught me so much about intersectional justice and showing up for others, other movements, other struggles. And I just would feel so enriched by having Jerry Marie be part of this circle. I guess the last person that has come to mind for me is a friend here in Athens who I've gotten to know. She's younger. Her name is Stephanie Flores. And I would invite Stephanie because I've seen how Stephanie has embraced and embodied restorative mindset, restorative ways of being, and is really incorporating it into her life and work. And I think would have so much to offer in terms of, where are we going? What do we need to heal? What do we need to build a better and more just and sustainable world? So I would be really moved and honored to sit in circle with those 4 folks.
I'm curious, we've talked about, you've done this work in a lot of different spaces, and we already determined, right, this work belongs everywhere. But is there like a moment, a place, a situation, whether it's historical, fictional, or in your life something you've witnessed recently, that you wish people really knew this work?
In and around the criminal legal system, it's clearly a structure. The movement around defunding police and prison abolition, those are all so important. And for me, it's about economic conversion. Like, how do we transition resources to help people solve problems on their own? So in and around the criminal legal system, we're spending so much. Even if we just look at it from an economic standpoint, we're spending so much money and resource, and we're just creating more and more harm and dysfunction and division. So that's where I would like, and we're moving in that direction in Georgia Conflict Center, but that's my passion and dream, is how do we make that happen?
Is there like a specific instance that comes to mind?
There's one man, he's an African American man, young man, who is sitting in jail right now. He stole the bike out of the garage of somebody I know. That person wants to sit down and repair this with them. They're neighbors, mm-hmm. and we can't make it happen. I've been doing this work for 20 years. I can't make it happen. And that is so sad. We could solve this in a way that would be, so that's a very concrete. Everybody wants to do it. The person that's sitting in jail, the folks that had their bike stolen, everybody wants to do this, and we can't make it happen.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. And I think like everybody knows that, the criminal legal system needs to change. The criminal legal system is where we need this work. But like, it's because of like stupid reasons where like they called the police because like something was stolen, someone was arrested, and now that has like started in some ways like irreversible process of, more harm where nobody's needs are getting met. Right.
Yes.
So thank you for the real specifics of that. What's one thing, could be a mantra, affirmation, or something else that you want to leave everybody here listening with?
I think you already said it, because we do use that one. I got it from John Lash here, but clearly it's around the work is too urgent to rush. Take time. Our culture tries to rush. This North American Eurocentric culture tries to rush, and we've got to slow it down if we really want to see the change that we're seeking. So it's too urgent to rush.
Yeah. Beautiful. 2 more questions. You kind of already gave me a suggestion, but who's one person I should have on this podcast and, hook it up?
I would recommend, Tarek or Chuck Curtis. Chuck Curtis will rock your world. He's a psychologist as well. So having that lens, he and I shared an office for 2 years, and it blew my mind every day. So I'd recommend him.
Beautiful. I'm looking forward to that connecting email. And then finally, how and where can people support your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Oh, we'd be so grateful. We are working on establishing a restorative justice diversion program right now. And, nobody wants to fund the startup, even though there would be so much money saving. So, you could go to gaconflict.org. We'd be grateful for any support, any connecting us with funding sources. We would be really appreciative. Again, as we're creating this restorative justice diversion program, we're working to train folks from the communities, and we want to pay them to facilitate restorative justice conferences. So that's going to take some money. And so anyway, if folks can support, we'd be grateful.
Beautiful. Well, we'll definitely link all that in the show notes in the description. But thank you, Daniel, so much for being the second white man to grace these airwaves. Really appreciative of your time, your stories, your experiences, your wisdom that you've shared. To everyone else who's listening, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure sharing this conversation, and we'll be back with another one next week.
Thank you, David, so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Daniel. Some of the things that stood out to me was the fact that Daniel really reflected on his whiteness and how that affected his work, especially in restorative justice. And I think this is really important because the stakeholders and indigenous communities that have been doing this work as part of their culture for such a long time often don't get the recognition that they deserve. It's important to understand how privilege can affect how a message is portrayed and who the message is coming from. And that's why I thought it was really important that Daniel acknowledged these roots in this podcast. How do you work to acknowledge your privilege in your everyday life? Daniel also talked about being responsive versus being proactive. He said, when you're just being responsive, it's not really going to transform an environment as much as when you really build restorative justice into the fabric of the way we operate. He also talked a lot about how we need to start with adults, and we need adults to be held accountable as well, because everyone can be a student of restorative justice, even adults. Thank you so much for listening to this episode today, and don't forget to check out our anniversary episode coming soon, and to check out all the links in our show notes below. And with that, I will see you next week.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.